The strawberry is distinctly Pan-American, both of the species from which most of the garden varieties of today have descended. Fragaria virginiana and F. kiloensis were secured by the Old World from the New. The largest acreage of cultivated strawberries is on this continent. The value of all the strawberries produced and marketed in North America each year, exclusively of the large quantity grown for home use, exceeds $20 million. This represents more than half of the commercial strawberry production of the world. The rise of commercial strawberry culture in the United States and Canada, which has taken place within the memory of men now living, is one of the most interesting chapters in North American horticulture. From the beginning of its Caucasian history, and probably for centuries previous, North America has been a land of wild strawberries. The first settlers at Jamestown in 1607 found them in abundance. Captain John Smith mentioned, among other fruits found in the New El Dorado, strawberries which ripen in April. One of the early colonists reported to his friends in England that when he went into the woods he came upon great areas of land overgrown with these plants, and the berries were 4 times larger and much more exquisitely flavored than the wild strawberries of England. In fact, so abundant were the berries, another man declares that in walking through the woods around Jamestown, it was impossible to direct the foot without dyeing it in the blood of this fruit. Some may consider this statement colored by the vivid experiences of the explorer, but certainly not the report of conservative Ralph Hammer that there were great fields and woods abounding with strawberries, much fairer and more sweet than ours. As fast as the Virginia settlers cut down the forests, strawberries sprang up in the clearings. When the fields had been cropped to exhaustion with corn, wheat, and tobacco, they were abandoned and new ground cleared, as was the custom in the prodigal husbandry of that period. These old fields soon abounded with wild strawberries. For a century or more after the settlement of Virginia, wild strawberries were so plentiful that very few persons take care to transplant them, but can find enough to fill their baskets when they have a mind in the deserted old fields. The wild strawberries of New England, meanwhile, the Pilgrims, Meanwhile, the Pilgrims, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and other northern settlers were having similar delightful experiences. Young's Chronicles of the Pilgrims records expeditions from Plymouth into the surrounding country on which they found strawberries innumerable. New England was forest-clad at that time, 1620. It was the custom of the Indians to burn over certain areas each year in order to secure ground in which to plant corn. Strawberries thrived in these burnt-over districts. Morton, who was at Plymouth in 1622, says in his New England Canaan, wild strawberries grew in plenty in the meadow and champaign lands. In 1629, William Wood visited New England. He returned to England in 1633 and there published the following year his New England's Prospect, which is a record of his experiences and observations in the New World. Of the Massachusetts plantations, he says, there is likewise strawberries in abundance, very large ones, some being 2 inches about. One may gather half a bushel in a forenoon. In 1643, Roger Williams wrote, "This berry is the wonder of all the fruits growing naturally in these parts. In some parts where the natives have planted, that is, planted corn, I have many times seen as many as would fill a good ship within a few miles' compass. The Indians bruise them in a mortar and mix them with meal and make strawberry bread. Strawberry bread was commonly used by the Indians in other parts of the continent as well as along the Atlantic coast. The colonists of New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, the Carolinas, and other parts of the Atlantic seaboard found wild strawberries no less abundant than in Virginia and New England. In 1683, William Penn mentioned with appreciation the abundance of wild strawberries in Pennsylvania. As the pioneers pushed westward in parallel lines occupying successively western New York, Michigan, and Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, and the great Mississippi Valley, the wild strawberry everywhere greeted them with an abundance of fresh fruit. A most welcome addition to frontier fare. It was so in lost Arcadia and in old Quebec. The wild strawberry refreshed the 49ers of California. And those who followed the Lewis and Clark Trail. In our own time, it has brought cheer to the settlers on the last frontiers. In Manitoba and Alaska, always the wild strawberry has been intimately and gratefully associated with pioneer life. We can hardly blame those who have enjoyed its bounty under these circumstances if they refuse to admit that any cultivated variety is half as sweet. For many years after the colonies were established, there was little, if any, garden culture of the strawberry. Wild berries were so plentiful that this was unnecessary. The abundant supply of native berries was appreciated all the more because of the limited supply of most other fruits. It was extremely difficult to secure improved varieties of apples, pears, and other tree fruits. There were no nurseries here then. Trees or scions had to be brought from Europe. The journey was long and trying, occupying fully a month, and the recourse to seedling orchards gave but a small portion of useful sorts. The first step in the domestication of the strawberry, naturally, would be to transfer to the garden some of the most superior plants found in the fields. Naturally. Since the native berry was so decidedly superior to the best European sorts of that time, there was no object in importing varieties from Europe, as was the case with most other fruits. It is possible that this amelioration may have been begun in a very limited way by the first settlers, since it is recorded by English horticulturists that the large early scarlet, a large fruited form of F. virginiana, was introduced into England about 1624. It is not likely, however, that garden culture began much before 1700. Any superior wilding that was found was more likely to be sent to Europe, where the possibilities of the American scarlet as a garden fruit were instantly appreciated and enthusiastically exploited, than to be kept in America, where every hillside and meadow yielded an abundant harvest to all who might seek it. Small towns soon sprang up, and the cultivated area surrounding them gradually widened as the land became more fully subdued in tilled crops. It was no longer the habitat of the wild strawberry. It became necessary for the housewife to go farther and farther afield to gather the annual supply for preserves and jams. There came a time when this trip became long and irksome. Then wild plants were transplanted to the garden. This was the beginning of strawberry culture. It now became desirable to scrutinize the wild plants more closely so as to find those of superior productiveness, size, or flavor, in order that the garden space might be most fruitful. This was the beginning of strawberry breeding. Until about 1750, there was no garden culture of the strawberry except of these transplanted wildings, and even these were grown only in a very few gardens. Nearly everybody, even the larger towns, still depended upon the supply of wild berries. Long before the Revolution, wild strawberries became an article of barter and sale in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Their streets resounded then as now with the long, drawn-out, and not unmusical vendor's cry, "Strawberries! Ripe strawberries!" At that time, the strawberry season was limited to the period of ripening of the nearby wild berries, which was not over 4 weeks. Now it is extended over 6 months, and berries may be had the year round. Garden culture of the strawberry began to receive a more serious attention about 1750, especially from a few well-to-do amateurs who could afford to employ private gardeners. The haute bois, wood and Chilean strawberries, were introduced from Europe, then together with some of the improved varieties of F. virginiana that had been developed by English horticulturists. Varieties listed in much of this interest was stimulated by the establishment, about the middle of the century, of the first North American nursery by William Prince at Flushing on Long Island, New York. For many years, Prince's Linnean Garden was the chief center for the dissemination of horticultural plants. William Prince died in 1802, leaving the business to his son, William Prince, who in turn handed it down to his son, William Robert Prince, so that the firm had an unbroken history of over a century. It exerted a profound influence during the formative period of North American horticulture. The first North American trade catalogs of horticultural plants were issued by Prince. In one of the earliest, sent out in 1771, 3 kinds of strawberries are offered for sale: large haute bois, or hot boys, the chili, the redwood. He sold these for 1 shilling per dozen roots. The haute bois, the haute boys. The haute boys was F. elatior. The haute bois of Europe, the chili, was F. chiloensis. The wild strawberries of the Pacific coast of North and South America, which had been introduced into Europe about 1735. The redwood was F. vesca, the common wild strawberry of England. The native scarlet, or Virginian strawberry, F. virginiana, was generally considered so superior in flavor to the haute bois and Chilean, as well as more prolific, that these were grown only in a few gardens. The redwood and its companion, the whitewood, were cultivated quite commonly, especially in the vicinity of Boston. Perhaps Prince did not like any variety of F. virginiana in 1771 because his stock was mostly imported from Europe, but it is more likely that no variety had yet appeared sufficiently superior to the wild strawberry to warrant propagation. Large, early scarlet, which became a standard variety later, had been sent to England more than a century before, but it does not seem to have been grown here until after 1800. In his 1791 catalogue, Prince added to his list Hudson, very large, fine flavor, and great bearers, 2 shillings per dozen. Later, this was called Early Hudson. It was the first named variety listed in North America and was a form of the scarlet. In 1790 appeared the first North American book containing much information on horticulture, Samuel Dean's New England Farmer. This is a cyclopedic work, patterned somewhat after Philip Miller's Dictionary of Gardening, a standard English book, much quoted in America at that time. It gives an interesting picture of the status of strawberry culture in North America at the close of the 18th century. There are 4 sorts, says Dean: the wood strawberry, the Virginia or scarlet strawberry, the haute boy, the hot boy strawberry, and the strawberry of Chile. He advises that the Virginian be grown. It is most common and perhaps most worthy of cultivation. The relative importance of hay and strawberries is clearly defined by Dean. Our grass fields often produce these strawberries in plenty, but it is better to have a spot of ground devoted to the culture of them, as they will be much larger and better flavored, and the trampling of the grass in the mowing may be thus in some measure prevented. His cultural directions, mostly quoted from Miller, are interesting not only as a record of the approved methods of that time, but also as evidence of the slavish copying of English methods, which characterized the early years of North American horticulture. Lay the ground out into beds of 4 feet broad with paths 2 feet or 2 feet and a half between them, these paths being for the convenience of gathering the strawberries and for weeding and dressing the beds. The plants should be in the quincunx order and 15 inches apart, so there will be but 3 rows in each bed. The plants should never be taken from old, neglected beds, where the plants have been suffered to run in a multitude of suckers, or from any plant which are not fruitful, and those offset that stand nearest to the old plants should always be preferred to those which are produced from the trailing stalks at a greater distance. During the summer, the plants should be kept clear from weeds, and all the runners should be pulled off as fast as they are produced. If this is constantly practiced, the plants will become very strong. Page 8. Wherever the suckers are suffered to remain, they rob the fruitful plants of their nourishment in proportion to their number. I have known where the old plants have been constantly kept clear of suckers. They have continued very fruitful 3 years without being transplanted. With slight modification, these directions written 125 years ago might stand for the Kevit system and other so-called modern methods of culture. Probably he had the scarlet strawberry most in mind when he advised, but little dung should be applied to the soil, as a large quantity will cause them to run much and to be less fruitful. The English practice of growing strawberries in raised beds seems to have fastened that name permanently upon the planting of small areas. Not until 1850 was there a strawberry field. One important departure from English methods is noted. The time to remove the plants is said by the above-mentioned author, Miller, to be September or the beginning of October, but they are known to do well in this country when removed in early spring. There is nothing in the New England Farmer or contemporaneous publications which would indicate that strawberries were grown commercially at that time. The only strawberries marketed were the wild ones that were peddled about the streets. Strawberry culture was confined to the home gardens of gentlemen of means who employed private gardeners. These gardeners were mostly from England, where they had been trained in the apprentice school of rule of thumb gardening. It was inevitable that they should persist in attempting to grow strawberries here exactly as they had been taught to grow them in England. The results were hardly less disastrous than was the case with grapes. For years, the general public considered strawberry growing an exceedingly difficult and uncertain matter that only the initiated might undertake with prospect of success. Here and there, wild plants were transferred to gardens, but most people depended upon the meadows and hillsides for a supply. This was the situation at the close of the 18th century. In 1804, appeared the first indigenous book devoted wholly to horticulture, The American Gardener, by John Gardiner and David Hepburn. The first edition gives but scant consideration to the strawberry. Wild strawberries may be planted in shady situations, but the others do best in open situations. Pineapples, chili scarlet, and hotboy are also very good strawberries. This is the first record of the cultivation in North America of the pine strawberry, from which most of the varieties of today have sprung. But it may have been imported some years previous, as it was quite widely disseminated in Europe by 1759. There was added to the second edition of The American Gardener a valuable treatise on gardening, which had been written many years ago by a learned and eminent Virginian who printed it for the use of his friends, and who resided at Williamsburg. Probably it was written before 1790. This anonymous but eminent citizen of Virginia, possibly John Taylor of Caroline, author of Arator, gives the following clear-cut directions on strawberry culture. It is evident that his experience had been extended and his observation keen. There are 3 sorts chiefly propagated: the wood, the scarlet or Virginia, and the hotboy. There is a green sort which some call Drayton and others pineapple, from its participating of the flavor of that delicious fruit. But none has ever been brought into this country, and it is but rarely to be met with, even in England. September is the best month for transplanting, though it is often done in February. But I have myself transplanted with success when in full bloom. The soil this plant delights in ought to be a fresh, loamy sort. If too rich, the vines grow rampant, and do not produce the fruit so good as in ground less enriched. All strawberries should be at least a foot distant, but I recommend 2 feet to have them in great perfection. They ought to be planted with alleys 2 feet wide for the convenience of going between to cleanse them of weeds, very prejudicial to them. In the spring, when your vines are in flower, if it is dry, water them, otherwise their blossoms will drop off. In September, you should pull off all the strings or runners and every weak plant. Dig up between the beds and strew some fine mold or wood pile earth between the plants, observing not to cover them with it. This will greatly strengthen them, and your fruit will be much larger. They do not last above 3 years, so that to keep constantly supplied, you should make a new plantation a year before the old ones are destroyed. The scarlet strawberry will come a fortnight sooner than any other sort. The chili strawberry will grow to the size of a hen's egg. The best dung, if any, for strawberries is that of cows, sheep, and pigeons. In order to have them later in season and to afford a succession, cut off the tops of some before they blossom, which will retard their ripening until the forward ones are gone. Many people keep them constantly strung, but I should imagine that wounds them, but in the proper season. The American Gardener's Calendar by Bernard McMahon, a nurseryman and seedsman of Philadelphia, was published in 1806. McMahon recognized 6 kinds: the scarlet, haute bois, Chilean, monthly alpine, wood, and F. anassa, the pineapple, together with many others, arising from these, differing principally in the color of their fruit. He recommended the scarlet and the pineapple for general cultivation and advised planting in beds 4 feet wide with plants 15 to 18 inches apart each way. This, likewise, was the advice of Grant Thorburn in his Gentleman's and Gardener's Calendar, showing that English methods still dominated American practice. A trade catalog issued in 1810 by William Booth of Baltimore offered, in addition to the several species listed by McMahon, 2 named varieties of the scarlet, large early scarlet, and Hudson's Bay. These 2 varieties soon became the dominant sorts and held this position for 50 years, until the introduction of the Wilson. Booth also listed a new strawberry raised from seed. This is the first record of a seedling strawberry in North America. The cultivation of strawberries for market began soon after 1800. Until then, only wild or common fruit had been marketed. Perhaps the surplus product of some home gardens had been sold or bartered among neighbors, but only in a very limited way. About this time, the nurseries began to propagate and disseminate several improved varieties of F. virginiana, notably early Hudson, Hudson's Bay, and large early scarlet. These were so superior to the wild strawberries offered for sale, especially in size, that soon there was a demand for them that could no longer be met by neighborly exchange of the product of home gardens. No. In response to this demand, commercial strawberry culture, as distinct from garden or amateur culture, began. The first commercial strawberry growing began about 1812 in the vicinity of the 4 largest towns of that period: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. At that time, none of these cities had a population of over 50,000 except New York. In his Travels in New England, written before 1817 but not published until 1821, Dr. Timothy Dwight notes that 5 kinds of strawberries were cultivated in New England: Red Meadow, White Meadow, Field, Hudson, and Haute Bois. Red Meadow was the common wild strawberry. White Meadow was a white-fruited form of that species, then as now quite plentiful in the Berkshire Hills. He considered Red Meadow the best of the 5 kinds and said he had cultivated it for more than 20 years, and during that time it has increased to twice its original size, being 4.5 inches in circumference. Soon after this, certainly no later than 1820, commercial culture in New England began, and the redwood and early Virginia, which Its large early scarlet emerged as the standard commercial source of that section. A reminiscence of this period was given by James F.C. Hyde in 1869. Those of us who are now actively engaged in strawberry culture can remember when there were only 2 varieties of this fruit in cultivation in the best gardens of Massachusetts, and when it was grown in very limited quantities for the market. We well remember when some of our neighbors picked daily 50 to 100 boxes, and that was all that could be disposed of at fair prices. The varieties then cultivated were the Wood and Early Virginia, the former an imported variety, the latter an American sort. In time, some more foreign sorts were introduced, but they were not hardy enough to withstand the scorching suns of summer and blasting cold of winter, and they were not successfully or extensively cultivated. Then not a mile of railroad was built in this country. All the fruit which was not that much was carried to market in wagons. Then the warm soils of New Jersey that now produce strawberries by the tens of thousands of bushels were covered with pines. Then the vast prairies of the West were an unbroken solitude.